Welcome to another tier list discussion. After I got through all of the 3D Mario games, I went ahead and made a tier list of all of them, so I decided to do the same thing with the Zelda series. Since I still haven't gone over Tears of the Kingdom yet, I'll save the 3D games for another time, so we'll only focus on the 2D games for now. First up is The Legend of Zelda. As the very first game in the series, I definitely have mixed opinions on it. It's a very good foundation for the series, and I do like a lot of its concepts. However, my first experience with it was as part of the GameCube collection that also had Majora's Mask, Ocarina of Time, and Zelda 2. Because of that, I didn't have the manual, so I basically got lost and ended up using a guide for the whole thing, which kind of defeats the purpose of this game. Part of the appeal of Zelda 1 is using the manual and figuring out everything on your own, so I never really got that experience, unfortunately. Again, it's not my least favorite Zelda game, and I do respect a lot of its concepts. Next up is Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. This is actually my least favorite 2D Zelda game, but even then, I feel like I like it a lot more than a lot of the fanbase. I can recognize its potential. It is one of the earliest attempts at an action RPG, and in that way, it's actually really cool. My problem with it is, it's so unfairly difficult at times that I get really frustrated by it. Unlike in Zelda 1, you have a life system, and if you lose all of your lives, you'll be sent back to the starting area. This gets old really fast, so even though I like a lot of the ideas in Zelda 2, I just find it too difficult, and I've never actually finished the game without copious save stating. My first experience with this was the 3DS Virtual Console release, and I had to constantly make restore points basically after every fight because of how much I was getting absolutely destroyed in every encounter. It doesn't help that with both of these games, I didn't grow up with them, so playing them in a modern context, they feel even more outdated. Next is A Link to the Past. This may be a controversial take, but I think A Link to the Past is just okay. I'm putting it in B tier because I really like it, but personally, I think I got overhyped on it. It's considered one of the best 2D Zelda games, and to be honest, I can see why. It definitely set the stage for a lot of the 2D games and even the 3D games that came after it. The problem is, I played a lot of those games first, and also, people hyped this game up so much that when I finally finished it, it's just okay to me. Again, I don't have any real issues with it, other than in the Dark World, I definitely feel like some of the damage scaling is pretty rough before you get the blue mail, and it's pretty late into A Link to the Past, and then it definitely gets a lot better after you're not dying to everything in my opinion, but in general, it's still a phenomenal game, but personally, just a little bit overhyped. Next is Link's Awakening. Actually, the first time I ever played the original version was for my review, and to be honest, I'm going to put it in the too similar category because I'd rather talk about Link's Awakening DX, partially because it adds so much content, and also because this was my first experience with Link's Awakening. This is one of my favorite 2D Zelda games. I really enjoy the world of Koholint, and I just like a lot of the level design. A lot of it definitely punches above the weight for a GBA or a Game Boy Color game at that, and in general, it might be one of my favorite games, partially just because it feels like the world is the focus for the first time in a 2D Zelda game on an emotional level more so than in A Link to the Past. In general, with the Zelda series, I like the games that focus a lot on the world and its characters, and Link's Awakening DX definitely excels at that with its storyline. In terms of gameplay, its biggest flaw is how few buttons you have on a Game Boy Color, so it can definitely get old having to swap items constantly, but other than that, I do feel like the fundamental gameplay design is really solid, but the overall atmosphere of Link's Awakening makes it one of my favorite games in the entire series. After that, we have the Oracle games, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages. To be honest, I have a hard time separating these two, so I'm going to put both of them in A tier. Of the two, they have a very different style. I feel like Oracle of Seasons almost feels like a pseudo reinterpretation of the first game, with a lot of enemies coming back, like specific bosses. Ages in some ways feels a little bit more original with its level design, but almost feels a little bit too ambitious to the point where I feel like some of the later dungeons get a little bit too complicated at times. In general, being able to cycle through seasons gives you a little bit more variety than just having 2 time periods. Also, Seasons has Subrosia as well. So in general, I do think Seasons might be the better game in a lot of ways, but I played Ages first actually, so I do have a lot of nostalgia for that game in particular, and again, in some ways it almost feels a little bit more original, because from what I recall, Seasons in particular draws a lot from the original. Next is Four Swords. I'm also going to put this in the too similar category, but I will mention that my first experience with this was also from my review, and it was not great because I had to use 2 controllers, and playing both characters was not fun. It would probably go into D tier if I was going to rank it, but I'm simply going to save my expanded thoughts for Four Swords Anniversary Edition. On the other hand, Four Swords Adventure, in my opinion, is a really good game. Revisiting it for my review, it actually surprised me because when I played it originally, I didn't really have a good time with it. However, when I got through it again for my review, I had a lot of fun with this. The level design is really tight, even though it's obviously not open like a lot of other Zelda games, it's level-based. The levels still feel very recognizably Zelda in overall framing. So in a lot of ways, this feels like a great way to have a condensed Zelda experience. Also, unlike every other multiplayer attempt in the series, this is the only game that feels like you can play it by yourself and still have a really good time with this game. It definitely feels like with the stance system, where you can have the links take on various like shapes essentially, like you can have them in a line or in a diamond shape to fight enemies off. In general, that flexibility makes it a lot more approachable by yourself, and it definitely doesn't feel like you have to have multiple people, which is also good because it's technically one of the most expensive games in the series, because you need like 4 Game Boy Advances, 4 link cables, and a GameCube. So it's really good in this case that it's one of the more flexible games in terms of being able to actually approach it in both ways. Obviously, I feel like it would benefit from more people, but it's not a requirement, and as someone who has played this game by myself, it's a lot of fun. I do recommend playing it, and I hope someday this game gets some kind of re-release, with online preferably, because I think it deserves a lot more attention. It is a fantastic game at its core. Next is Minish Cap, which might be my first traditional 2D Zelda game, though to be fair, this was about 15 years ago, and to tell the truth, I don't necessarily remember which one I played first between Minish Cap and A Link to the Past on GBA. I really like Minish Cap. It's definitely a little bit polarizing because of how small scale it is, pun intended, but I definitely feel like, as someone who was trying to get into the series at the time, I liked how small scale it was, because it made it a lot more approachable. I still got turned around a lot, even though this is one of the more beginner-friendly ones for the most part, though there are a couple of difficulty spikes I'm not a big fan of. But it was a nice entry-level game. I think what happened was actually the same thing that happened to me with Fire Emblem, where I got Fire Emblem first, and then right after I found a copy of Sacred Stones. I got stuck on the one and ended up finishing the second one before. The same thing I think happened with A Link to the Past, where I got the GBA version of that, got stuck, found a copy of Minish Cap, and then ended up finishing that first because it felt a lot more approachable and beginner-friendly. Again, if I had any complaints, it's that the game does have a few difficulty spikes, and also, to be blunt, a lot of the side activities in all of the Capcom Zelda games, Minish Cap, Oracle of Seasons, and Oracle of Ages, tends to be a chore. For the Oracle games, you have the Gotcha Seeds. For the Minish Cap, you have the Pico Blooms, and the figurines. So I wouldn't recommend 100%ing any of the Capcom games, to be honest, but I do recommend playing them. They're all available on Switch Online now. If you have the expansion pass, for example, you can play Minish Cap, and with the base tier, you can experience the Oracle games. And I would recommend all three, because I do think they're actually really fun games. Next would be Phantom Hourglass, which actually would be my very first 2D Zelda game. I played it at the same time as Wind Waker because I already got spoiled on the ending, so I remember I'm pretty sure I picked up both on the same day, actually. And I played them kind of alternating, basically, and as a result, I like Phantom Hourglass more than most. That being said, I'm still only going to put it in B tier because at the end of the day, it still has a lot of problems. The big one, obviously, is the Temple of the Ocean King, which you have to go through multiple times, and it definitely gets old after a while. But also, I feel like past the Temple of the Ocean King, you have a lot of very original concepts. A lot of the characters feel very original in the world of the Ocean King, and in general, it feels very fun to go through, except for that, and also occasionally the touch controls can be a problem. Like having to spin little circles on the touchscreen to roll can definitely be a problem, and they actually fixed that in the next game, which of course is Spirit Tracks. I really like Spirit Tracks, and even though it's not top tier for me, mostly because I have respiratory issues and the overuse of the DS's microphone is not my favorite thing in the world, in general, I actually think this might have one of my favorite interpretations of the world in the series. Zelda is fantastic in this game, and she's actually a major player, which actually is nice given that she's mostly fridged throughout the rest of the series. In general, the temples are really clever, though in general both Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks tend to be a little bit easy, but again, as someone who is getting into the series, I didn't really mind that with Phantom Hourglass. With Spirit Tracks, I also feel like having a more steampunkish version of Hyrule also made it very distinct from any other interpretation. Also, Phantom Hourglass isn't great in terms of music, but Spirit Tracks has a lot of phenomenal music, and I think this might be, along with Four Swords Adventure and the Oracle games, one of the most underrated Zelda games. I know it's unlikely because of how this game was built, but I'd love a modern remake of sorts of both games that basically made them more like traditional top-down Zelda games and found a way around a lot of the touchscreen stuff, though to be fair, I'm not sure how you'd make that work. Again, I'd love to see something like that though, because I do wish more people could experience these games, and it would be a good opportunity to get rid of some of the filler from Phantom Hourglass. Next is Four Swords Anniversary Edition, released in 2011 for the series' anniversary. I played this one before, obviously, the GBA version of Four Swords, and in general, it's just a really short bonus. In this case, it was actually a free download on the DSiWare service and 3DS as well, so it's not anything particularly special. I'm going to put it in C tier because it's just kind of inoffensive, but it's almost too basic, and even playing it single player, they had to simplify it even more because of how much multiplayer was integrated into it. So I do feel like Anniversary Edition specifically, while less frustrating because of not having to juggle multiple links in this case as much as playing the original version by myself, it almost feels like there's not much going on if you're not playing it in multiplayer. It's not awful by any means, but it definitely just feels a little bit like a nice bonus for A Link to the Past or as a free download, but beyond that, it's not particularly special. Next would be A Link Between Worlds, which is actually another one of my favorite 2D Zelda games. Obviously, this is a case where I don't necessarily have nostalgia for it, because I played a bunch of the other ones first, but personally, as someone who's lukewarm on A Link to the Past, I genuinely really enjoy this game. Personally, as someone who found A Link to the Past to be a little bit too difficult at times, I don't mind that the difficulty scaling in A Link Between Worlds is a little bit more generous. basically the biggest issue with it, is a lot of the temples feel very comparable in difficulty because you can tackle them in any order, for the most part. I also like the item rental system, where you can get all the items at your own leisure, and thus you can kind of open up the world at your own pace and decide what to do first. I like that freedom. It definitely set the stage for later games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and I definitely feel like it's a very interesting formula in a 2D Zelda game having that level of freedom. Next is Triforce Heroes, which is another game I played for the first time for my review. I am very mixed on Triforce Heroes. Parts of the game are really fun as a single player, but a lot of parts are not fun at all. I specifically hated every time the game expected you to balance on essentially a scale platform, because you are constantly having to switch between characters frantically using the touchscreen. You can't even use like a button for this, which is also annoying. So I had a lot of trouble with certain stages. Specifically, I remember in the desert world, both with the boss and the stage before it, because of just having to balance everything by myself. In multiplayer, and if I could experience the game in multiplayer, it would probably be like in B tier, but playing it by myself, I'd put in C tier just because a lot of the stages were just kind of miserable as is. But again, I don't think it's a bad game by any means. I think it's actually a great game. It's just not built with single player in mind, and compared to something like Four Swords Adventure, which is definitely scaled with single player as an option, it definitely feels disappointing to kind of go backwards to relying on multiplayer a lot more and being a little bit more prohibitive as a result. Finally, we have Link's Awakening for the Switch. This also might be a slightly controversial take, but I actually don't mind the art style. I think it complements the world of Koholint really well, for reasons that I can't really talk about because of spoilers. But I actually personally like how the toy look of everything makes it feel a little bit uncanny at times and less real, and that's all I'll say about that. Obviously, the controls are better with full analog. Actually, it's not full analog movement, it's still 8-way gated. But having more diagonal options than in the original helps a lot, and obviously not having to pause as much because you have more buttons is also really nice. However, I actually think in some ways it's actually worse than the original because you're missing the photo mode, which added a lot of charm in DX specifically, and also a lot of the new content like the Dungeon Maker ends up feeling kind of like padding. So while I still think it's S tier because I think it's an actually really great remake of the game, and definitely does a good job preserving a lot of what made Link's Awakening special, while also adding in a lot of new stuff and fixing up some things by streamlining everything, it definitely feels a little bit rough around the edges because of the new content feeling a little bit tacked on, and also the performance isn't great with a VSync solution that often causes the frame rate to oscillate wildly between 30 and 60 FPS. Also the depth of field, I forgot what the exact term would be, but the blurring around the screen to kind of, tilt shift, that's the term. The tilt shift look can be a little bit distracting at times, it's a little too strong, and I wish they had toned that down. But in general, I still think it's a great remake, but in general, I do think there are merits to both versions, oddly enough. I don't think there's necessarily an objectively better version, because both have some pros and cons. But with that, we've gone over all of the mainline 2D Zelda games. Obviously, there are a couple more, like there's the spin-off Cadence of Hyrule, and there are the two Satellaview games, but I wanted to focus only on the mainline games for this video. Again, at some point, whenever we get through the Tears of the Kingdom review, I'd like to revisit this and then rank all of the 3D Zelda games. But with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join next time for another discussion.